Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications at SBAM. We are pleased to be with you. This is actually show number 247, but it also is our 2-year anniversary. So we're going to get to that after we welcome our new member of the week, South Shore Family Practice in Marquette. They were founded in 1988 and they provide compassionate and comprehensive medical care for the entire family. So welcome South Shore Family Practice. On behalf of our sponsor, Marana Group, a data document and distribution company in Kalamazoo. So Brian, today is the 2-year anniversary of the very first public small business briefing. It was then called the Daily Briefing. And so I thought I might remind everybody what that looked like 2 years ago. So it was you and Rob, and I don't know, look pretty similar.
I don't know. So doing these types of things was kind of new. It's weird now to think about. It's kind of new, at least new to us, to do a live broadcast, and didn't really have a background that was particularly interesting, and so this was more like a hostage video, this first one. And but really at this point, we're right at the point when it was clear that some things were going to be closed down, but pre stay at home or stay safe, stay at home order, whatever that was called 2 years ago. It's hard to remember, but really it started out as daily briefings, as you had mentioned. But at that time, I thought it was worth mentioning that here at SBAM, with 28 staff members, including me, and things were changing so quickly that every single job in this organization was repurposed at that point, because we found that we needed people to keep track of so many different channels of information. So there was the IRS who were making changes, and the Department of Treasury. There was OSHA and the health departments at the state level and the local public health departments. And also in the federal government, the legislature and Congress and CDC, of course, which was kind of frontline at the time. So all of these different things and information was changing so quickly that we assigned across our staff people to just keep track of those websites and announcements and press releases, and to sift through and curate information, bring it to our members in real time, and so that they could manage through a very uncertain time. But there was another important change that happened, and that was for all of us to be just available to take calls and to walk through things with people, to think through things with our members who really didn't know what to do, especially when there were some of the executive orders. It was we've never dealt with things like this before, and what does it mean? And this one says one thing and another one says another thing, and my industry kind of straddles the line between these two different industries. Which one am I supposed to follow? And so to really, we adopted an approach, which was first listen and be empathetic, even if we've heard a story like that 10 times today, that we're gonna listen and be empathetic through it, and then we're just gonna to be a thinking partner with people and to provide whatever information that we can. And then it occurred to us, though, as we were doing that with people, we're getting all this great information and insight. And the daily briefing kind of came out of this desire to say, we're doing this anyway with our members. Let's just every day broadcast and say and share some of what we've learned. And it was changing daily at that time. So 5 days a week, and also we did plenty of them on the weekends too, that we were doing these briefings. Eventually, we scaled it back to twice a week. I wondered whether or not things would change or enough information would be out there to where we'd have enough content. And yet, Sarah, it seems like every week we go a little over because there's just so much that is happening. And it's not all pandemic now. That's the nice thing about how this has transitioned. We still talk about pandemic issues, but it's really just about the greater economic climate, the business community, and the things that are changing, and what our members need to know. So for our 28 staff members, or 27 other staff members aside from me here at SBAM, couldn't be more proud of the work that the team did throughout that 2 years. And boy, does time fly. In some ways, it seemed like a different a different lifetime ago. In other ways, it seems like just yesterday.
I agree. I'm really proud of the work that we've done to bring our members in the small business community valuable resources, including this show. And it was a really fulfilling time. It gave people something to do, something you could be a part of the solution and helping our members through it. So I'm grateful that we had that opportunity. So it's nice to commemorate 2 years. And it's great that we're still doing the show. We did invite Rob to be part of today's show. He is off doing something fun this weekend, though, but he would have been here if he could. So Brian, we have
life days. Yeah, his life days. He's off for the weekend. It's only Thursday, but in Rob's world, that's the weekend now. No,
until July 1st, and then it's back to the real world for Rob, right?
Yes, yeah. So he totally flunked retirement. So we have a guest today, and I was really excited about today's guest because it comes on the heels of my favorite conference that SBAM does each year, which is the My Hidden Talent workshop. And this is where we provide both inspiration, but also nuts and bolts of how to find and successfully hire people with disabilities as an intentional strategy. And one of our partners in the programming for this conference is Michigan Rehabilitation Services. And Jenny Piatt is with us today from the Michigan Rehabilitation Services. And Jenny, maybe just share with us, with an audience, many of which probably have never heard of your agency, what it is that you do and how it fits in, particularly in this time when there's so many workforce shortages.
Yeah, great tee up, Brian, and having the 6th annual, right? It was our 6th annual, the Your Hidden Talent workshop. I'm just proud to be a partner with you on that. I think, Brian, your message is so important right now. Talent is such a strong need for business, particularly recruitment. So for the folks on the line here, again, I'm Jenny Piatt. I'm a division director with the business services side of the house, if you will, for Michigan Rehabilitation Services, and that's found in the Department of Labor and Economic Growth. And I always kind of joke with Brian, coming from state government, that truly, from state government, we are here to help you. So that is our intention. But really, our division and our agency really is here just to couple of things. One, to raise awareness, of our mission and work with employers, with partners, promoting a talent pool of qualified candidates. And supporting your needs in terms of hiring, retaining, and retraining of individuals with disabilities too. While at the end of the day, it's increasing your bottom line and creating a truly inclusive workforce culture. I think one of the things, Brian, that we're starting to see more of in terms of trends is long haulers with COVID. And so I think more businesses are starting to experience maybe current employees who are maybe weren't even hospitalized, but have difficulty breathing. Might it be, there's even studies out there that are showing, loss of hearing and, other kind of long-term effects. Our agency is here to help support you and support your employees through that process. So we provide a variety of different services, both to help you acquire talent, but also to help you retain talent, reduce your work risks, as well as network with our community partners too, that play a really big role here to help support and kind of streamline those business solutions for some of the challenges that you might be encountering.
Well, it really is an ideal time, I think, for employers to think about this, because I know in the past, and having spent years trying to advocate more for, in a lot of ways, for people with disabilities to be more included in the things of the world, that in the workplace in particular, there's this thing called accommodations. Sometimes it can be really scary, but if you think about it, make accommodations for all employees. All employees have certain needs, and employers, for good employees, will make the accommodations that they need in order to get the best talent. And for disabilities, it's really no different. And so it sounds like this big scary thing. It's usually not. It's usually very, very minor, and it tends to be a very loyal workforce as well. And so you bring up an interesting aspect of this too. Michigan has always relied on an older than average workforce. You compare it to a lot of states, especially southern states. And so as people age, there are certain disabilities or certain struggles that people can run into How would somebody, let's say if an employer said, you know what, I've got some needs, I've never even thought about this before, so I want to check it out. Or I've got maybe some team members or a team member that is struggling with certain functions. I'm not exactly sure how to help, and I'd love to have somebody to work with me and through what the options and what we can do. How would somebody even just take that very first step in getting started with this?
Yeah, I think the best way, Brian, just, again, to streamline it for you, because again, government does seem to be kind of big, and where do you start? Actually going to our website, www.michigan.gov/MRS for Michigan Rehabilitation Services. There's a section there that you can just click on, and it says for business. And there's actually, just a one-click, a referral, and that automatically comes to our email box that we triage every day. So if you have a question, it's maybe about a current employee, or you're interested in, Brian, as you're saying, like kind of that recruitment piece, and looking at just a qualified talent pool that's a darn reliable talent pool as well, that we can also set up, different services, not only from recruitment, but job fairs, whatever that might look like. And we customize that for your needs. So I think our bet, and you're always, of course, anyone's welcome to contact me directly. And I can believe Sarah's put all that information in the chat for folks. So piatt@michigan.gov, more than happy to, answer any questions you guys might have afterwards. But once we get that referral, Brian, and we get the inquiry, based on what it is, and especially if it's maybe it's that piece where they have an employee that they want to look at potentially an accommodation, or maybe it's something new that's arrived and they're looking at, a change in their job, and maybe they want to upskill somebody that might need some additional accommodations to participate. Again, our team, we've got occupational therapists on staff. We also have rehabilitation and business services specialists on staff to help walk you through that. So I always say, you might just see, one person from our team, but it's kind of that Verizon effect. You'll see one person, but there's a team behind that person to help support you. And I also always like to mention, we're in it for the long haul. I think sometimes businesses are a little apprehensive that they might start engage in, recruitment and or on the retention piece, and they're fearful that, wow, it's state government, I might get reported, or is this a MIOSHA thing? We're not an entity that is intended to provide, we're there to provide supports for you. We're not a MIOSHA, we don't have particular regs that we're holding folks accountable to. The intent is what kind of wraparound services can we provide, and it's long-term. So we're here for the long haul. I think that's the other fear sometimes, is you engage and participate, and then you might feel like, okay, where's my supports? But again, we're here for the long haul for you.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on, both in partnership in the conference, but also coming on the briefing. Now, if you'd rather, you could always email sbam@sbam.org, and we'll connect you too.
Absolutely.
If you go that way. But we put both in the chat, and if you're watching on Facebook Live, we'll put in the comments there too how you can get straight through to get things started. So if you are struggling and finding talent and you've never checked this out, I would encourage you to do so, because people with disabilities tend to be very determined. They know how to persevere, have to be creative in order to do a lot of things that the rest of us take for granted. And that tends to be a good set of criteria for a workforce, folks that are determined and creative and persevere. And so it's definitely worth checking out. Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Jenny. So Brian, let's continue on, and we have quite a few topics we want to get through today. The Federal Reserve met this week, and you speculated recently about the difficult decisions they needed to make. What did they decide?
Well, they ended up moving interest rates up 0.25%. So the Fed funds rate, kind of what you consider like the risk-free rate, the base rate that a lot of other things start with, went from 0.25% to 0.5%. So not a surprise that they had scripted this out ahead of time. And I had wondered a bit before about whether or not the the overall, rise in the risk of recession, higher energy costs and gas prices going up, that whether or not that would maybe change some of the outlook in what the Federal Reserve decided to do. And frankly, I don't think that they could afford to back off on their original plans, because it's just that this inflation keeps on, month after month keeps on stacking up, and so we saw for last month that inflation, the annual rate clocked in at 7.9%, and so setting another 40-year high record, and I think there was some expectation that maybe it would start to settle down by now. I thought I'd even just to pull up the actual press release that the Federal Reserve put out after the press conference with their chair, and in it says inflation remains elevated, reflecting supply and demand imbalances related to the pandemic, higher energy prices, and broader price pressures. Those broader price pressures, a lot of them being just what's happening with wages and overall cost of doing business. And so it's just everything's getting pushed up at the same time when there's still supply constraints and shortages in certain areas. They go on to mention the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is causing tremendous human and economic hardship. Implications for the U.S. economy are highly uncertain, but in the near term, the invasion and related events are likely to create additional upward pressure on inflation and weigh on economic activity. So we already had a series of things that were problematic in terms of the building inflation, workforce shortages, supply chain constraints, and then you put the international uncertainty on top of it, and the last month's inflation. And I think the Federal Reserve came to the conclusion that while it's tough and it's such an uncertain environment to continue with raising rates, but I think they felt like they really didn't have any choice given how high inflation remains.
So practically speaking, what does this mean for our members, for small businesses?
If you were to think of interest rates as being kind of, you have a certain type of lending, and that's based on different things. Part of it is the risk. So, the market will price risk of lending out money in a certain way, and that's a chunk of it. But it starts with this base rate that the Federal Reserve sets. And so whether it's a credit card, or it could, in some cases, business loans and mortgages, that either directly or indirectly, all of those, most of those borrowings are tied back or kind of start with this. Now, they raised the rate yesterday. That doesn't mean that everything else just moves up. The market already anticipated that. You already saw market rates rising over the last few weeks in anticipation of what the Federal Reserve was going to do yesterday. And but there's a lot of continued expectation, and I thought the Federal Reserve went out of their way to make sure that everybody understands there will be multiple rate increases spread over the next year. And they feel that they really have to do this in order to get ahead of inflation, given that shortages and supply chain issues and workforce shortages, all the things that are happening on top of the international uncertainty are going to continue to push the cost of everything up. And that means that inflation is something where they're more concerned about that than the negative impacts of continued rate increases.
So with higher interest rates, they're typically meant to cool off the economy and tame inflation. But last year, the economists seemed to think that it would be normalized, that inflation would be normalized by later this year. Is there any chance of that happening?
Well, I think that there's diminished hope that that by the end of this year, that inflation will just kind of settle back down, although that's still what the goal clearly is. And so February did not give any confidence at all. We saw a lot of things, that they said that they changed the monetary policies with respect to the bonds that they were purchasing. They changed which they should have done 6 months ago. Started the process of increasing rates. So again, they should have done 6 months ago, back when they didn't really think that inflation was such a big threat. And so the fact that we're still, it's not settled, it's not leveled, it's actually still kind of edging up. I think it really does put a lot of these projections that things would really kind of naturally settle down by the end of the year with these rate increases. I think it puts in question. The rates will end up, the inflation rates will end up settling down. It's just a matter of how easily or what it takes to get them back to what we'd consider like normal. The annualized rate from last month being 7.9%. That is, it's been a very, very long time. I was 4 years old last time that our nation saw inflation rates of this nature.
So what are we talking about in terms of a potential recession? We do have some economic fundamentals that are looking strong, but what are the risks of a recession going forward?
Yeah, the good news is that there are a lot of, there's still a lot of demand. There's still a lot of, economic activity, hiring. There's upward movement in hiring. There's a lot of really good things in the economy still to look at. So it's not without hope that this year is going to turn out okay. But there are different models that are starting to really edge up. That chance of recession is being pushed up. So Goldman Sachs, for example, and their forecast, the likelihood of a recession in the next year, they put it 35%. There's some others that have it as high as 50%. So that's a difference. That's a distinction that I do not think was present 6 months ago, where there was concern about inflation, there's concern about supply chain shortages, but you really didn't pick up on major concern about a recession. And so now, as some of the economic modeling shows, that's a real possibility. All of these things that are happening for shortages and increased costs and supply chain disruptions and international strife, in addition to high inflation, therefore the borrowing rates have to be pushed up. That all of those things happening together, it really does create some downward pressure on the economy, which clearly still wants to go up. And so it makes it's much, much less clear. So I certainly would not call a recession a foregone conclusion, but it looks like a much more distinct possibility than it did just a few months ago.
All right. A Federal Reserve appointee recently withdrew from consideration by the Senate. So what was the problem there?
Yeah, there was an appointee that her name is Sarah Bloom, are asking for a top position at the Federal Reserve Board of Directors. And it was kind of a lightning rod. Now, remember, the Senate has to approve these appointments. So the president makes the appointment, the Senate has to approve them. There are 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. All 50 Republicans said this appointee is unacceptable. So they needed all 50 Democrats to say yes, so that the vice president could break the tie. And so the opposition was really pretty strong, not based on any kind of personal background issue, but more on a philosophy that this particular person wanted to bring to the Federal Reserve, which is that banks needed to start considering in their credit decisions the climate impact of the borrowers that they were lending to. And so this would be a brand new kind of regulatory scope brought to the supervision of banks, where the Federal Reserve would say, okay, banks, you need to be accountable for, when you're lending money, you need to be accountable for understanding the climate risks that your borrowers are bringing with their activities, and take that into consideration with your credit decisions. And that's pretty far outside of like a normal banking consideration when they're making a credit decision. That might belong in some environmental regulation departments, but in terms of how a bank would operate, brand new territory being chartered there. And Senator Manchin, whom where I think we've all become quite familiar with the senator from West Virginia, was one that said, that he would be voting no. And what that did effectively was to end that the nomination and request. It was, she withdrew her, sent a letter to the president, which often happens when it's clear Senate's not going to approve. They rather than take a no vote in the Senate, they withdraw their nomination, and the president will pick somebody else. So it actually is somewhat of a. I have a background in banking. I'm maybe a little biased in this, but the idea of having that type of thing put into credit decisions, and having the bank regulatory structure that supervises banks hold them accountable for those sorts of things. It really would. I think it would change our financial markets in ways that we really couldn't even predict at this point. So I think that Manchin and the majority of the Senate took the safer route and said, let banking regulators worry about the financials and cash flow and creditworthiness and the sound practices of banks, and let the environmental agencies and the environmental laws worry about the regulations on that side of the house.
All right. So when we were talking a little bit earlier, you mentioned how what's happening with the war in Ukraine can impact things happening here. So what are some of the impacts in Michigan beyond the obvious energy costs?
Yeah, so we do see, everybody's heard about the chip shortage, and so the vehicles aren't being shipped, and they can't complete vehicles because there are not enough computer chips. Well, there's possibilities of additional or continued and heightened shortages in that area because semiconductor plants, they get some of what they need, neon, for lasers from Ukraine. And so obviously there's going to be a disruption in an already very fragile and behind supply chain for computer chips. So the semiconductor industry has some reliance there. Also, palladium apparently is something that is mined from Russia. That's a major or an essential component of catalytic converters, and so another component to vehicles that potentially this disruption on the international market. It's what we've seen with the pandemic, but now in the case of war, everything is connected. And in our case, with the auto industry, and Michigan being so reliant on the auto industry, that the supply chain touches almost everywhere in the world. And so to have Russia and Ukraine at war, sanctions against Russia and Ukraine, not at a point where industry can operate or function like it would under normal circumstances, create additional hardship for the supply chain that will hit Michigan particularly hard because of our reliance on the auto industry.
All right, we have a couple more topics to get through. This half an hour has gone really fast today. Let's talk about the U.S. Supreme Court. There are some big decisions coming up, one that is particularly impactful in the regulatory world. Can you share that?
Yeah, there's actually kind of an old case that they just had arguments on, and this goes back to the Obama administration. And the idea is whether the federal regulators could impose emissions controls on power plants, essentially changing the character of the electric grid without explicit authorization from Congress. And the reason I thought this was kind of notable is because it's kind of a similar argument to that vaccine mandate before, which OSHA had a rule, and the United States Supreme Court said, you don't have anything in statute that explicitly gives you anything similar to what you're doing. You can't just rely on these general words in law to go this far, this deep into regulation. It's the same type of thing, only in this case, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the Biden administration argued it doesn't matter because that particular rule is not even in effect anymore, but it's not a well-kept secret that the Biden administration has additional environmental regulations that they're planning to unveil here shortly. And so the Supreme Court is looking at an old case, and the subject of this old case might not be as active today as it was back in the Obama administration, but it could have, their decision on it could have major ramifications in the future. Here's what it boils down to for us, though, that we like for the statute to say what the regulators can do, and not to have it just at the whims of broad and wide interpretations of the regulators. So if it's one thing when the law says it, and that's one of the things we do, compliance education, the law says it, and you got to follow the rules and the regulations. When there are regulations, though, that are based on things that are not explicitly in law, how much latitude they take can sometimes be problematic. So I think the Supreme Court looks poised to kind of curtail the amount of latitude or leeway that a regulatory agency can take when drafting rules that are not explicitly allowed for under statute.
All right. Now, one quick thing to mention today is that Governor Whitmer has officially turned in her signatures. So she's running.
Yes, and not a surprise, but this is an important and essential step that has to happen. So we said, I think last month, maybe 4 or 5 weeks ago, that Garrett Saldano had turned in his signatures in order to be one of the Republicans to take on the governor. There are 11 candidates, I believe, or maybe 12. There's a lot of them, but only one that has turned in signatures. Governor Whitmer today turned in signatures, 30,000, in order to be on the ballot. So this promises to be a very active political year. We've got over 70 members of the House of Representatives that are guaranteed to be brand new next time because of new districts and term limits and so much turnover in the House of Representatives, a lot in the Senate, and then, of course, the executive offices in Michigan. So this will be a very, very active year, and one of the essential, to get on the ballot, even if you're the current governor, you have to turn in signatures. Today, the governor turned in the maximum number of signatures allowed in order to qualify for the ballot.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for you on this beautiful St. Patrick's Day. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll be back here on Monday.
Yeah, on Monday, and go green.
Go white.